Today on the Property Management Show, our special guest is dad to two beautiful girls, a big sports fan, and happens to be a co-founder of Tenant Turner.
Yup, we're interviewing James Barrett about how rental property marketing has changed over the years and what to expect looking ahead. As a bonus, you'll also hear some insights about data that they've collected regarding tenant marketing because, well, that's their forte.
Before we get started, I'd like to note that this podcast is brought to you by 4+, a marketing agency that creates and implements owner lead generating plans for property management companies.
We've been doing this since 2012, and we can help in all aspects of owner marketing, from developing a conversion-driven website, lead nurturing, reputation management, content creation, online ads, you name it. Visit 4.5.com to learn more. Now, without further ado, here is our interview with James Barrett from Tenant Turner.
This episode is sponsored by PM Grow Summit 2021, a conference where successful property managers network and learn from world-class thought leaders. The fourth PM Grow Summit will be a virtual conference, but it's not like any virtual conference you've experienced before. Our platform gives event participants an experience as close to an in-person conference as possible. For example, create your own personal avatar and wander the online, three-dimensional world of the conference, where you can network, hear our expert keynote speakers, attend workshops, and more, all from the comfort and safety of your own home. Join hundreds of property managers and experts in the industry on January 20th, 21st, and 22nd. Get a sneak peek and get tickets at pmgrowsummit.com. That's pmgrowsummit.com.
James, thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to talk about, changes in rental property advertising and marketing. So to start things off, how about you walk us through kind of the big changes that you've observed in, rental property advertising in the past 5 years?
Sure, Marie. Yeah, it's been a very interesting time, I would say, in rental property advertising, particularly on the single family side. We've seen kind of this transition away from Craigslist, which was for the longest time everybody's bread and butter. It didn't matter what market you were in. And then Zillow came and really, whether it be through acquisitions that they made of Hot Pads and Trulia, or just through their own emergence and new features for the Zillow rental marketplace, they definitely have come on very strong. But recently, we've started to see a new Craigslist killer coming about with Facebook Marketplace. And Facebook Marketplace, they've established some partnerships with some key listing sites within the industry, in particular Zumper and Apartment List, that allow them to be the sole source providers of feeds, direct integrated feeds to Facebook Marketplace. So that's really been a big disruptor for the industry. And then I'd say another big thing that's happened over the past couple of years has been related to market consolidation. We've seen more and more acquisitions within the space. In particular, a key player for the longest time, RentPath, who owns rentals.com and rentalhouses.com, and at one point had acquired Lovely. They have now been acquired by CoStar, who's really bulking up its listing site dominance in order to compete with Zillow. They have a number of different web properties now, with apartments.com being the anchor property, but with their acquisition of RentPath, they're very much getting into big multifamily, mid-sized multifamily, and single family. And so we expect that they're going to be a key player in shaping the industry, for the next few years.
That's interesting. And do you have any insight as to the reason for these big consolidations going on?
Yeah, it is interesting. So, one of the more recent ones was RentPath. Some of that was financially motivated because RentPath had been acquired at one point by a private equity group, and RentPath was basically nearing bankruptcy. So they had, big web properties, rentals.com, Apartment Guide, major assets, and they were doing okay but not well enough to sustain themselves. So CoStar was able to come in because they just have so much money, which is also why I expect them to continue to acquire more and more assets. But they just have so much cash, particularly driven by their commercial data assets that they have. That's their cash cow. And I expect that they'll continue to buy more and more web properties that are going to impact the residential property management side.
And how do you see the acquisitions impacting, I guess, the usability of those platforms for property management companies and advertising on them?
So I think it's usability. The thing that jumps to my mind is cost. And what we're seeing through some of this, market aggregation is there's fewer players, which means less competition. And another, trend that we've seen here recently is the Zillow paid inclusion model, where if you had a single home, condo, townhouse, duplex, any building that had less than 50 units, you didn't have to pay to list on Zillow, Trulia, or HotPads, and the majority of your leads were going to come from there, and everybody's very happy. It's a utopian time within the residential property management space. But then through these consolidations, Zillow just got so dominant. They're like, why aren't we charging people for this? We kind of got them where we want them. So let's go ahead and start putting some dollar signs next to these listings. And that's the same thing that's happening, I think, on the CoStar side. On apartments.com, they've always charged for apartments. They've never figured out how to charge for small multifamily. They've never figured out how to charge for single family. But when they acquired RentPath, they picked up rentals.com, which has really been the primary paid source for single family rentals. So my expectation is that they're doing these consolidations in order to create a sense of dominance and exclusivity that's going to increase the cost of property marketing, particularly for the small multifamily and single family manager, owner, operator.
Yeah. The Amazon of rental advertising.
Oh man, maybe it'd be good if Amazon got into this space.
Yeah.
Facebook's dabbled into it, and they've candidly been very successful with doing it, and they've driven a significant number of leads, and we'll talk more about it later, but a significant number of leases as well. So we've seen where, probably 10, 15 years ago, the asset that these listing companies started with was basically a domain name, rent.com, rentals.com, and they were able to build around that. But with Facebook's entrance into this world, we've seen them be able to get pretty dominant pretty quickly. And it's because they're a technology company. They've already got the eyeballs. So yeah, who knows?
The trust too.
Yep, exactly.
Which I do think is interesting, because when I think of Facebook Marketplace, and Marie and I were talking about this too, and I think we talked to you about it a while back, when I see Facebook marketing, Facebook Marketplace, I see it sort of like the Craigslist of Facebook, but that's not how people are perceiving it. Marie, you had mentioned how you thought it was kind of sketchy to find
beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in the beginning, Facebook Marketplace had all the negative connotations of Craigslist, just because there was a lot of sketchy stuff.
When people sell DVDs on there, it's like, buy my Harry Potter portfolio for $5.
Yeah.
Buy my collection of VHS tapes. Yeah. Do not trust.
Yeah. But I think now what's interesting is where it started as kind of like this Craigslist type thing. I think when they partnered with Zumper, they were able to create a different interface for searching for rental properties that was a lot more specific to the UX needs of a renter.
It looks more official too.
It's more official too. It looks like, hey, they actually have a solution for this, which means it's not.
It doesn't appear like Craigslist, and I think that's what a lot of people probably think it does because they haven't looked into it.
Yeah, and a big difference with this is around individually contributed content. So before Facebook Marketplace established a relationship with Apartment List and Zumper, there was no feed to Facebook Marketplace. So any of the rentals that were on there were added by Marie and Brittany and James and, landlords or scammers. And, as we've learned through various situations, not every account on Facebook is a real account. They're deleting millions of accounts on a daily basis. So you're right, Marie. It was an environment that was wrought with fraud and scams when it initially rolled out. And I don't think Facebook was prepared for that. I don't think that they realized the level of scam activity that occurs as it relates specifically to rentals. And so I think their partnerships with those listing sites, that created a filter. Like, you don't you don't feed to Zumper an apartment list unless you have property management software like Tenant Turner or Buildium or whatever. And so there was a filter there that said, all right, these listings, they're indirectly or directly verified by coming from a company, not a scammer or not, a landlord who is clearly just not going to be as professional or polished as a professional property manager.
Yeah. And so since we're talking about, Facebook Marketplace and their partnership with Zumper and Apartment List. So you mentioned in a previous conversation that Tenant Turner has been collecting data on, the volume of leads that come from Zillow versus Zumper. And I know how many years ago, very obvious, Zillow is like the winner, but ever since they rolled out this paid option, a lot of people are trying to look for alternative ways to advertise their rentals. And so do you have any kind of preliminary data that you've seen that you can share with us in terms of number of tenant leads or even the quality of leads that are, coming in through Zumper versus Zillow now versus then?
Yeah, and this is now like kind of the $1 million question, particularly as people are being charged for listings that were otherwise free just a year ago. And what we've seen is the leads are now, like, Zumper is now being competitive with Zillow. Like, Zillow was the top dog for the longest time, and they probably would account for up to 75% of the leads that came through Tenant Turner. And when I say Zillow, I'm referring to the Zillow group. So that's Zillow, Trulia, and HotPads, plus some smaller sites that they re-syndicate to. So for the longest time, they represented 3 out of every 4 tenant leads that came into the Tenant Turner scheduling system. And then what we have seen is the steady decline of Zillow and the steady rise, I shouldn't even say steady, a very abrupt rise of Zumper. And there's a direct correlation between the quantity of leads that came through Zumper and when they established that relationship with Facebook. Funny thing is about Zumper, people don't realize Zumper's been around for a long time. They're not as established as say Zillow is, but they're not just been around for a year or two when they started working with Facebook. They've been around for a decade or so, have raised bukus of VC money from the Silicon Valley folks. So they're well funded. They're established, but they never had the market share that they needed until their partnership with Facebook Marketplace. So what we've seen now with Zumper is they are basically neck and neck with Zillow.
Wow.
Yeah, and that happened over, say, 2 years.
What was it before? I mean, prior to the Facebook partnership, I'd never even heard of Zumper, which you think that I would have. Yep. And so prior to that, how did they just keep getting funding, or did they, because if their market share was so small, how are they able to keep it going? I mean, they definitely struck gold when it comes to the Facebook partnership, because people don't have to go to Zumper to apply. Yep. They go to Facebook. People are on Facebook every single day, all the time. So it's just so interesting.
Yeah, and it was a lot of VC funding that kind of kept them, I don't want to say afloat, I certainly don't know their financial situation, but kept them relevant, kept them present. They did have an acquisition at one point where they acquired PadMapper, but PadMapper was an ILS that was created to basically scrape Craigslist and put their listings on a map before Craigslist had that feature. They eventually got sued by Craigslist, but they had already built a brand and had created a site that people were interested in. So Zumper had acquired them. So I think Zumper, for the longest time, they were moving methodically with the eye of the VCs, trying to create a Zillow competitor. And honestly, probably for the investors who put money into it, they're going to see a return on it because of the Facebook relationship. For them to have gone from, say,
Totally.
sub 3% of all leads that came through Tenant Turner to 30% of the leads. I mean, that's a
In a
significant
year.
jump. Yeah, yeah, it's such a short. And we just don't see things like that,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's trend lines. There's rarely this hockey stick acceptance rate like we've seen with the Zumper group.
Yeah. So I guess tip for this is if property management companies aren't leveraging this tool already, they really need to jump on board with it because they could
Yeah,
be potentially, did you say 30% of the market share? And it's
30%.
it's rising.
Yep.
So it's like you're missing out on 30% of possible opportunities for your property owners if you're not using the platform.
Exactly. And there's some people who are, like, how do I replace my leads from Zillow if I don't want to pay them? I mean, the reality of it is we're moving to a model in which you're going to need to pay who charges you. It's going to be a situation where Zillow is not going to lose their dominance because they're charging people. As much as I think a lot of people in this industry would like that to happen,
Mm-hmm.
there's lots of like threats, from Zillow that they feel. But the reality of it is, right now, a third is coming from there. So you don't want to like turn off the Zillow spigot
Yeah.
to just turn on the Zumper spigot and backfill it, because to your point, Brittany, it's the same problem. If you don't list on the Zillow group, well, that's a third of the opportunities that you're giving up. And if you don't list through Zumper, that's a third of the opportunities that you're
Right.
giving up. And within this business, you need as many at bats as you can. So,
And I mean, it's the same idea with what we say with owner marketing. So a lot of people ask, hey, if I'm going to do pay-per lead, should I do all property management or should I do
yep,
Google ads? It's like people are searching on different channels. So
yep,
if you do one and don't do the other, you're going to miss opportunities either way.
yep.
Yeah, it makes a lot
And
of sense.
And that's a good point. And like you said, yeah, probably it will impact priority, right? Just like in that case, what's my first priority? If I have a limited amount of spend, a limited amount of time, do I go APM or do I go Google
Right.
Ads? You have to make a decision on that. It's the same thing in this space, and because Zumper currently is free, that's definitely the one. Why not? Why not do
Mm-hmm.
it? Especially if you're using a Tenant Turner or other tool that can syndicate for you, it'll go there automatically at no cost. Zillow, you are in a position now where you do have to have a separate contract with them. So all else equal, yeah, you would want to prioritize Zumper over, the Zillow piece, if for no other reason,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to have the contract and you have to have, you have to pay them.
Yeah. So, given that you are an expert in this field, I'm curious to know if there are any sort of KPIs that you feel like property managers should look at when they're trying to prioritize which advertising platform they should pool more money to when they're advertising their
Yep.
rentals.
That's a great question. And what we have in Tenant Turner, what we've kind of like focused our efforts on are two KPIs in particular when it comes to your listing syndication. One is the number of leads that you get from that particular lead source, which is obviously an indicator of likelihood to get a lease out of it. But also we track which of those leads you ultimately end up signing a lease with. So it doesn't make sense for you to pay Zillow if you're going to get a bunch of leads but none of them convert. Vice versa, it does make sense for you to pay Zillow if you get even a few number of leads but they all convert. So we look at that conversion metric. And I do have some recent numbers here, and these are keep in mind these are nationwide numbers. Each market is going to be a little bit different, but over the past quarter. What we've seen is that of the leads that have come through Tenant Turner, 28% of them have come from the Zillow group. So that's Zillow, Trulia, HotPads. 26% of them have come from the Zumper group. So that's Zumper, PadMapper, and Facebook Marketplace. So as we talked about, you kind of don't want to have one or the other. You want to have both. But again, if you're limited in terms of your financial resources or your ability to get it out there, Zumper can essentially get you as many leases, probably more leads. Just the nature of Facebook Marketplace, probably more leads. But the good thing that we're seeing is that it's also going to get you the same number of leases than say what the Zillow group is being able to provide.
So basically, what you're saying it is in terms of number of leads that come in, 28% come from the Zillow group and 26 from Zumper. So it's a close battle, but in terms of
Yeah.
quality, even if there's this kind of notion that, Facebook Marketplace attracts kind of like a different kind of demographic than Zillow,
Yep.
what you're seeing from the Tenant Turner side is like they kind of end up converting the same number of leases.
Yeah,
Or
and that was something
number.
that we were surprised to see, because
Ah,
there's this belief that, oh, they're on Facebook, they're just looking at stuff, and
Right.
because there's stuff there, they want to know what Brittany's doing this weekend,
Yeah.
and they want to see what Marie posted earlier today, and then maybe they make their way to Facebook Marketplace, and while on Facebook Marketplace they bought a kayak, sold that Harry Potter thing, and then now they're inquiring about a rental property. And so I'm sure there's some of that, so there's, and that's probably a hard thing to quantify, is like, the seriousness of those leads. But at the end of the funnel, where it indicates, where are these leases actually originating from, we're seeing that it's converting quite nicely. And again, Zumper is that Zumper, Pad Mapper, and Facebook Marketplace, but it is dominated by leads that are driven from Facebook Marketplace.
Is this something, is this data that only your team has access to on the back end, or is this something that if I'm using Tenant Turner, is it data that I can see in my dashboard so that I don't have to crunch the numbers on my own?
Yes, great question. Yeah, so this is definitely data on a customer by customer basis. They can go into their Tenant Turner account, and we have a report that will highlight this information for them and tell them which leads have been selected and what the lead source is. And from there, they can figure out, well, hey, maybe I shouldn't pay for this particular service, or surprise, surprise, rentals.com is actually generating a lot of leases for me. It's, it's not a lot of leads, but I'm getting a lot of leases for it. It's well worth that investment. And it's certainly a tool that our customers can use to then go back to their owners and say, maybe even create a new line item. Hey, this is a premium marketing fee. And when you pay
Yeah.
this fee that I just marked up, we're going to be able to get you more leads more quickly and ultimately have a higher conversion rate.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I didn't know that.
yeah. And so I know that you touched on this a little bit earlier, and how, there are a lot of changes happening, but we all know that in recent memory, 2020 has forced a lot of other changes that are just out
Yeah.
of the ordinary. And so what kinds of changes have you observed within rental property advertising that is caused by the pandemic? So my guess would be more kind of like, um, not touchless, but it's like more virtual showing,
Low
Contactless. Yeah.
contact. Yeah, contactless.
contactless
Yep.
move-ins
Yep.
and stuff like that. And
Yep.
kind of like, have you seen an abnormal surge in that adoption rate for this, for that kind of technology? And what are the pros and cons? Like, are scams kind of like
Yeah.
going off the roof now?
What are people not thinking about in those situations? Yeah.
Yeah, it is an interesting time, and we saw, within our system, a huge movement towards, self showings to be more contactless, where people are utilizing the electronic lock boxes, and certainly there are other services out there that do that, like Tenant Turner, and I know they've seen an uptick in business as well, particularly as it relates to that contactless showing experience. Where we definitely put a huge emphasis is around that scam prevention that you talked about, because unfortunately, I think a lot of people moved very quickly into a self showing, not really prepared for it, and maybe in some cases they got a little bit blindsided by it. And for us, we're very much in love with the process that we've built, because it is highly effective. But we have heard horror stories from other people who have switched to come to Tenant Turner because they weren't ready for the scams. They knew that was a possibility, and maybe that's why they were hesitant to do self showings in the first place. But then, because of the pandemic, they may have just jumped into it too quickly and weren't fully prepared for it. But for those that came over to Tenant Turner, we've seen an increase in scam activity, but because of the pieces of the process we've put in place, there's not been any additional scams related to our customers. But it has caused more rental scams, which were already on the rise to begin with, but the pandemic helped accelerate that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So people are, oh, you can go first, Marie.
Oh, I was just going to make a comment. So I guess it was like the perfect storm. More people, more property managers were kind of forced to
Yep.
take on the, the self-showing because they had no other option for safety of their staff. And then more scammers are taking advantage because either they're like really need the money, right? So there are more scammers that are
more
being
desperation.
born.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Brittany.
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, I don't even remember what I was going to say now. Let's just, I can ask the next thing I was going to ask you about. So with the changes of people rushing to move into this contactless entry system, you said that this is what I was going to ask. You said that you guys had put some barriers or protections in place to help the process. Are you able to share any of those things that you added in or advice?
Yeah. And really it's, I hate to like overuse these terms because I think they are used quite a bit within the technology space, but we've used machine learning and artificial intelligence powered scam detection and prevention for years. But because of the increase in scams, it allows our AI to learn faster. So it's helped accelerate learnings of scammer behavior, which makes our scam prevention amazing. So it's weird, right? Like I'm excited. Like whenever we sniff out a scammer, like we get jazzed up because like, what's he gonna do? Or like we know he's a scammer. We know he or she. We don't know actually the gender,
Thank you. Yeah,
he, she, her, yeah, whatever. Like we see the presence of a scammer. We use device fingerprinting. We use system fingerprinting to pick up where these folks are coming from. And as they hit these it's almost like little tripwires in our system. And as we pick up these little pieces of the puzzle, like, well, what are they going to do next? And it's like, oh, they've got a new behavior. They have a new process. And then using the machine learning, it increases the artificial intelligence, and it ensures that future scammers, that scammer of course too, but then future scammers can't reuse those same tricks. So we're essentially creating this like web of ever expanding tripwires that put, basically protections around our customers' process and properties. So sorry, I get excited about
I love
it because it's like, it's like so nerdy, but it's like so fun because it's like you're spying on somebody and you're like watching them do something bad, and we're like, got them.
We're gonna get you.
It's like Big Brother.
It is like Big Brother, and I also feel like it's not. People probably think it's just as easy enough to put a lockbox on the door and say, "Hey, go check out the property." But it's not that. You can't just set the property up the way it needs to be set up for contactless entry. It has to be all of the other processes, monitoring the postings or monitoring the listing providers, seeing if anything sketchy comes up or somebody's trying to advertise your property. That's really interesting. And I think that's would be very helpful to a lot of people, just knowing it's not just set it and forget it. You have to have a system like that.
Yeah,
exactly.
I'm curious to know what is the most common blind spot when someone is trying to jump from traditional showings to like self-showing type of technology?
Yeah, I would say, blind spot or impediment, it's around getting the owners on board with it. A lot of our customers, the third party property managers, so they have to get the owners on board with the concept. And that was actually one thing where the pandemic was very helpful. Right? Because, a year ago, a property management company may have been, let's do this self-showing thing. It's going to save us a bunch of time. 38% of showings come in after hours. We're going to lease in half the time. It's going to be amazing. But then they don't get their owners on board with it.
Because the owners are like, then what am I paying you for?
Right.
Exactly. And then it turns into this whole thing.
I can do it myself.
And so then property managers, okay, I'll show it. It's fine. But then when the pandemic hit, and people didn't want to meet people anywhere, certainly not for an open house, right? Mm-hmm. That's when the owners, what was the owner going to say? No, don't try to lease my property. No, you go and you meet these 10 people there, and I hope you don't get sick. Like, it really put a situation where the residential property managers who wanted to do this and wanted to try this, they had that impediment of the owner saying no was now removed.
Yeah. Do you see that that's going to stay consistent once things finally, hopefully, get back to normal? Do you think that contactless, or the progress that has been made towards contactless, is going to be maintained after this whole 2020 nonsense?
Yes and no. So one thing we noticed in our data was normally on Tenant Turner, about 50% of showings are in person and 50% of showings are self showings. We noticed during the pandemic that they jumped pretty significantly. As you can imagine, self showings represented 80% of the showings that occurred, and then the other 20%, those were either being virtual showings, which we still consider in person because a person is committing their time to do a FaceTime showing while they go to the property. So a lot of those were actually those virtual tours where a person was stepping them through the property over FaceTime, Zoom, or Google Duo. But then there were still people, particularly in areas less impacted by COVID, where they were still doing in-person appointments and following appropriate protocols and stuff. So we definitely saw a big uptick. But then after things kind of settled, for lack of a better word, as soon as some of the answers were not settled, right? But as soon as, people felt more comfortable, we actually did see, us get back more to a normal balance. And so what that tells me is that during the peak of uncertainty, March, April, early May, any of the properties that were occupied, there was a no in-person showing situation. They did not want to bring outside people to a home that was occupied and potentially had families in it. There's just too much risk. So what we're seeing now is, people are getting back to in-person showings if that's their primary preference. But maybe they're waiting for those units to go vacant from being occupied.
Yeah.
So I definitely see I see those owner approvals and buy-in into self-showing still sustaining itself after we get back to normal. But I do see just in the data, like there are folks who like to show property, and they like, the fact that we can coordinate this appointment. Exactly.
I think they like the gut feel too when they meet people. And so I have one last question, to wrap things up. Given everything that we've discussed today, what advice can you give a property management company owner when they're planning out their rental property advertising in the coming year? Because 2020 is almost over.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Everything that comes with is almost over too.
we're all just waiting for 2021 to turn around, right? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think biggest piece of advice is, where possible, leverage automation. We talked about Facebook Marketplace. You don't want to manually post to Facebook Marketplace. That is a insanely cumbersome process. But as we talked about, the data indicates that there are lots of leads and lots of leases that come from that. So if you're not doing it and you have to do it manually, that's an unfortunate, that's a whole mess right there that you or your team's going to have to deal with. But using automation, using a syndication tool like Tenant Turner, stuff like that, that will help streamline that process. Same thing when we talk about self-show and stuff like that. There's a huge opportunity to automate parts of the process so that you can focus on the more important parts of your business. And that's what we're here to do, is to help people with that automation. And we look at the silver lining of this pandemic. We look at, the positivities of the lockdown and things like that. And one thing that I've been impressed by is people leaning into technology a little bit more, leaning into automation a little bit more, because we do live in this contactless environment. And I do look forward to people continuing to adopt more and more technology that suits their business, because it's ultimately going to make their businesses better. It's going to make them happier. They'll be more efficient and effective. And obviously, the more our customers grow, the more we grow, and we're in full support of that.
That was really insightful. And I think just all of the information was really helpful for me. And I'm sure our listeners are going to love this. So thank you so much for joining us. This was really exciting.
Absolutely. I love talking to you, Brittany and Marie. It was a lot of fun.